Now, despite what some of my recent videos might lead you to believe, I still really like Dungeons & Dragons, especially 5th edition. I run and play it quite frequently. I'm working on a module, and I think it's a pretty good entry point into the hobby of role-playing, especially given the quantity and quality of DM-centric content like modules and maps. But I can like something while also recognizing that there are some aspects of it that suck, like the unbalanced classes, tendency toward long, repetitive combat, and lack of interesting mechanics for things like lighting and rations, despite allegedly being focused on dungeon crawling. And it recently hit me that all three of these issues, along with many others, can be traced back to what I consider to be the biggest problem with modern D&D, the reliance on a traditional adventuring day with multiple encounters and short rests. Let me break this down. On a most basic level, the short rest, long rest system does not work, primarily because there's rarely any reason not to commit to a long rest when you and your party find a safe place and a break in the action. Narratively, it really feels no less plausible to be attacked during a 1-hour short rest than during an 8-hour long rest. 4th edition cut short rests down to 5 minutes, and that's the system I use in my 5th edition games. But that still doesn't solve the problem completely, because the reliance on short rests assumes that you'll be burning through multiple encounters every day. Most people will agree that D&D combat takes a long fucking time. It can be fun, mind you, but like anything, it can overstay its welcome and become less fun over time, especially if it's just there for the sake of being there instead of resolving a turning point in the narrative. And if you follow the suggestions in the Dungeon Master's Guide, they will have to be there for the sake of being there. Seriously, 6 to 8 encounters per day? I'm curious to know anyone who runs anywhere close to this many. I know that's supposed to be an upper limit rather than a consistent expectation, but it does set a precedent that the adventuring day should often consist of at least a few encounters. But outside of a dungeon environment, I personally can only think of a few situations where I'd want to run more than 1 or 2 fights in a single day. And despite its name, I think D&D should be able to handle more than just dungeon crawls. It's the world's biggest role-playing game by miles, so it should support all kinds of campaigns as long as you stay within the genre of epic fantasy. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that you should spend most of your campaign outside of the dungeon. And when dungeon crawls do come along, you should mostly treat the dungeon as just another set piece, rather than a massively complex labyrinth with monsters in every room. If you really want to immerse your players into the idea of delving into a pitch-black ruin full of terrifying creatures, then you should try a system like Torchbearer, with actual interesting mechanics for things like light sources and rations, and where monsters are something you should actually be afraid of. D&D's idea of drilling in the dangers of the dungeon is throwing an endless barrage of repetitive encounters to drain the character's hit points and spell slots. This concept was acceptable back in the day, but it's long outdated now that we have so many great video games that can provide the same experience at a much faster pace, including some games with mechanics that are lifted straight from D&D. When you sit down to run a combat encounter at an actual D&D table, you don't want to waste your players' time. You want to run a unique and memorable fight with meaningful stakes, and the standard adventuring day runs completely against this principle. But Cass, a lot of you are probably thinking, there's nothing saying you have to use the standard adventuring day. And if that's you, you're not wrong. You can and should ignore all expectations about the adventuring day and instead use combat encounters sparingly, ramp up their difficulty, and set up unique atmosphere and stakes for each encounter. But there's still a problem with this. The classes are very clearly designed for PCs to face several combat encounters each day. You've got your warlocks and your monks, who rely heavily on short rests to replenish their resources, and then you've got your wizards and paladins, whose abilities are mostly replenished during long rests. And you've also got your fighters and rogues, who don't really need to worry about resting at all except to restore hit points. To 5th edition's credit, I think these classes are balanced pretty well as long as you use the adventuring day suggested in the DMG. In earlier editions, marshals just couldn't measure up to spellcasters no matter how you structured your encounters. The problem is that the standard adventuring day is fundamentally broken. Outside of a dungeon environment, there's almost never a reason to run several encounters in a single day. And even in the dungeon, if the PCs can find a safe place, they might as well just commit to the full 8 hours. So what you're left with is wizards being blatantly superior to warlocks, on account of having vastly more spell slots. Even the most tricked out Eldritch Blast is just not going to measure up to a barrage of fireballs and aberration summons. Keep in mind that these imbalances apply to NPC villains as well, so if you don't give them enough unique advantages to compensate, your warlock villain could be a complete joke. In the grand scheme of things, class imbalance definitely doesn't ruin 5th edition, and I'd definitely rather have unbalanced classes than a slog of repetitive encounters. But if some classes are outright weaker than others, that can certainly make the game less enjoyable for certain players. Especially in a system like D&D, where combat is supposed to be a tactical minigame that's fun in its own right. Fortunately, I can envision 2 possible ways to get rid of this problem completely, although they both involve some pretty radical rules changes. The first is to design a system where unimportant encounters can be resolved with just a couple of die rolls instead of the full turn-based combat system. The PCs could run into a pack of goblins, consult a table, find out how many hit points and spell slots they lose, and come up with a brief description of the fight, akin to a montage from an action movie. That way, DMs could grind down on PC resources without forcing the players through hours of monotonous combat. The other is to overhaul the core classes so they don't rely heavily on short rests, or at least roughly equalize their dependence on short rests. I personally prefer this option because the combat montage system would still pressure DMs to throw in lots of combat encounters, even if they might not be narratively appropriate. Regardless, both of these are much easier said than done, and D&D homebrew is not my strong suit, so I'd probably end up butchering both of these projects, especially the class redesigns. But if I've sparked anyone's inspiration to homebrew either of these features, I'm glad I've done so. And if you ever finish, feel free to leave your creation in the comments below. And if anyone at Wizards is somehow watching this, then please consider lessening the importance of short rests for the next evolution that we'll see in a couple of years. And whoever you are, thank you so much for watching and have a great day.